Welcome to the NNP Symposium. This session we have actually re-recorded after the symposium due to some audio issues. So if you watched it live, I hope you'll find that the audio is much better now. If you did not get to catch it live, then should be good. There will be the original Q&A session at the end, so the audio quality will change and there'll be a different facilitator on at that part. So that should explain that. And without further ado, Rick, I will let you take it away.
Well, thank you very kindly, Leanna. I appreciate it. We're going to have a nice ride on the Confederate treasure train today. We're going to take you on a ride that will go from Richmond, Virginia, all the way down to southern Georgia, and how money was dispersed, purloined, stolen along the way, and it's going to all be done through a numismatic lens. First of all, let us just let you know that we're Talisman and Coin Productions. We have written 2 books on this particular subject, and the main theme throughout it all is, where did all the Southern dough go? There was tens of thousands of dollars in gold, silver, and bullion that was on a train that left from Richmond when Richmond fell. Go ahead, Beck. And the second of the 2 books, the sequel, has just come out, and it's called Sumptuous Southern Stories of Missing Confederate Money. And it covers a wide range of topics that will be near and dear to a numismatic's heart, and that's the way we'll try to tell this story. Now, way back when, it's April 2nd, it's 1865. We'll get to the fall of Richmond in a moment, but the bottom line is, the story is not about war, it's about the escape of all the money that was in the Treasury and many of the banks in Richmond when Richmond fell to the Union on April 2nd. And you can see by these 2 maps that we have obtained from older sources that the little train left Richmond. You can see the train depicted right here. Made it first to Danville, then to Greensboro, down to Charlotte where there was a mint, into Abbeville, and eventually into Washington, Georgia, where in time the train itself was captured by the Union. And we'll start the story in just a moment in Richmond, but you can see here that the Confederate, all the money left Richmond, went through Petersburg, Burkeville, past nearby Appomattox, and eventually made it down to Danville, where the train actually rested for 1 week in April. This is the actual fall of Richmond, the Queen City of the South. April 2nd, people are fleeing across the James River. Those that had horses and wagons could take what they possibly could under all this barrage of heavy artillery. But the wealthiest folks and the most influential folks left by train, and there may have been as many as 8 of these trains loaded with bank gold, with CSA bonds and currency, and a lot of private wealth, which is not well tabulated and could have belonged to the Knights of the Golden Circle. The first stop was Danville, and Danville is close to the North Carolina border. The train itself, or several trains, stopped there for 1 week, and there's a rumor, a very well substantiated rumor, that a great deal of money, some 40 kegs, each filled with $5,000 of silver dollars, Mexican silver dollars, were unloaded in Danville. Ostensibly, the money was unloaded, taken to the Bank of Danville, and it was exchanged at the ratio of $70 of paper Confederate money for every $1 in Confederate dollars, and then some of the money was loaded back on the train. However, there were at least 30 kegs of silver that disappeared, and it's rumored that they are all buried now in the Green Hill Cemetery in downtown Danville. And the people that researched this the most believe that it's a plot belonging to Robert S. Jones, lieutenant of the 18th Virginia Infantry. The curious part is there's 1 burial and there's enough room for 10 bodies, and everyone believes that there are at least 30 kegs of silver still buried in the Green Hill Cemetery. Money was all rolled off. barrels, and it was intended to go to Robert E. Lee, but he had just essentially he had surrendered to U.S. Grant on April 9th while the train was still in Danville with all the money. And the money could never make it to him. His forces were outnumbered by the Union, and that's why they believe the money was simply buried. No one has been given permission to excavate or to explore that cemetery. So there could still be upwards of 30 barrels, $5,000 each of silver dollars buried. Here, of course, you see one depiction of Robert E. Lee surrendering on April 9th to Grant. And at the very same time, the very next day, when Davis and his party learned that Lee had surrendered, they decided to hightail it further south to Greensboro. Now, what's depicted at the bottom, all the gold coins, there were $450,000 in gold coin and bullion, most of them double eagles, struck probably in Philadelphia, that were intended for Lee as well. They remained on the train, and they became part of a much bigger controversy as the train went further south. Okay, next stop was to talk to General Joe Johnston. He wanted to pick up some money for his troops as their final payroll. It's reported that he picked up $39,000 in silver Mexican reals. They had a lot of Mexican reals because they could not do business overseas because of blockades. They could sell cotton in the south to Mexico, and that's where a lot of their revenue came from. Therefore, the treasury was filled with Mexican silver, not U.S. silver. This leads to a really, really spectacular little story in terms of engravings that were made on these coins and other coins that commemorated the fall of the South. First of all, it was April 7th when the train stopped for General Johnston. This is very much the way the scene would have looked. That was called the General, that kind of locomotive. A lot of freight cars behind it carrying gold, silver, and a lot of paper currency and all the archives of the Confederacy. And by April 26th, General Sherman accepted the resignation or the surrender of Joe Johnston and his entire army, which numbered about 36,000 men, maybe a few less at that point in time. It was a larger surrender than Robert E. Lee's army of Northern Virginia. Joe Johnston was the commander of the Army of Tennessee. And so when he surrendered, all the territory in the South that the train was passing through was no longer part of the South. It had collapsed. And so all this money and all these very rare records of the South were traveling in a very vulnerable way as they went further south. Now here is one of the silver reals struck in Mexico, 1861. And what's unusual about this, and this was provided to us by E. Silem, by the way, it says, from General Joseph E. Johnston, it was engraved May the 1st, 1865. That was the last payroll that he, General Johnston, made to his troops. He was able to distribute about $1.17 per man, which would be about $30 today. Not a whole lot to travel on. A lot of men had not received pay for several weeks, and so this was very important to them to receive this last dollar from the South. Now, on a more spectacular level, after the fall of the South, after men had returned home, some people were presented with some very lovely medals, all from either U.S. or Mexican coins. The one on the north is again a Mexican, looks like a gold coin. It was struck in honor of the fall of the South. It says for this particular individual, whose name I cannot see, but anyway, it was a P.P. Parker, I believe, of the North Carolina Regiment, 17th North Carolina Regiment, and he mustered out High Point, North Carolina, April 26, 1865. And so it's a very beautiful coin, very hard to come by. And even more spectacularly was this particular coin, again from General Joe Johnston. It was given to a gentleman who was a surgeon, and he had served in Charlotte, North Carolina. And again, it says he's honored as a token of esteem for his fidelity to the Confederate cause, having remained steadfast until the command was surrendered April 26, 1865. It's a Liberty seated $50, beautiful coin, handsomely engraved, and presented much after the war, probably 2 or 3 months after the war. That's all right. Then we go even further south to Charlotte, North Carolina, which was the next stop for the train. And Becky and I had the good fortune of stopping here during our so-called Dixie Dash while we're doing a lot of research for this particular book. This is the Charlotte Mint, and it was active until 1861. And it produced gold coins, and only gold coins. It was literally moved and saved from bulldozers in 1933, I believe. And it still has this beautiful gold gilt eagle above the door. This is an example of a chest, a strong box that was used to convey gold to the mint. And it was shut down in 1861 when the Confederacy took it in trust and never struck another coin. So it was a true casualty of war. However, when the train came to town, they parked and stored all of the money from the Treasury and the banks in the Charlotte Mint, and it was guarded with about 150 men. Okay. Now, things got a little rough for the treasure train as it went further and further south. As a matter of fact, there are 2 places where there were no railroad lines. In one case, in a little town called Chesterville, South Carolina, the rail tracks had been torn up by General Sherman. They couldn't proceed. They had to put everything onto wagons, move it further south into a little town called Newberry, where they could pick it up again by train. And they went to a little town called Abbeville, South Carolina, which is known as the birthplace and the deathbed of the Confederacy. They made it there on May the 2nd. Once again, they had to take everything off of the train. There's no train track at all to go into Georgia. They had to do everything by pontoon bridge across the Savannah. And you're moving gold, you're moving silver. It's extremely heavy. Wagons were getting stuck. And there are a lot of well-substantiated rumors that a lot of the gold had to be left behind in the little town of Vienna on the South Carolina side of the river because it was too precarious to get across this pontoon bridge. Now, the ironic part of this is that Vienna and a little town called Petersburg, Georgia, were both completely submerged in water in 1954 when a dam was built. So those towns are now under 30 feet of water, and if there is any treasure, it's under 30 feet of water, and it's all under the jurisdiction of the federal government because it was a federally approved dam. So now we'll tell you a story. Once they got into Washington, Georgia, which is about 20 miles south of the little town of Vienna, there was a story about this beautiful chest that I'm about to tell you about. It is rumored that this had been on the treasure train. And here's the way the story goes. It was discovered in an old branch building in Washington in the early 1900s when they tore down the old building. And it had been sitting there for decades. They moved it. It was the permission of the owner of the building. It was moved to a library that had just been built in the 1920s in downtown Washington. What's unusual was that it sat there unopened and untouched since the Civil War. And an 80-year-old gentleman came in one day and said, damn, when I was 20 years old, I guarded that strong box. That was on the treasure train. And I can attest to the fact that that was one of the one of the strong boxes that came in on the Confederate treasure train. So in 1948, a local paper in Atlanta put up the money to bring somebody in to open this treasure chest very carefully. A lot of fanfare, the press was there. When they opened it up, all they found was one Jefferson nickel dated 1939 that apparently a small child had slipped through the lock while it was in the library. The chest is still there, and the rumor still persists that it had been one of the three major treasure train chests that had probably the bank gold in it, not the Confederate treasury. Now, we're going to wander off into an interesting story here that does relate to the treasure train once it got into Georgia and once it got to Washington. They were able to put many of the boxes and strong boxes onto the Georgia Railroad line, which goes into Augusta. This is really important because Augusta was a very significant city at the time. There are rumors that they wanted to go from Georgia down to Savannah to get the money across the Atlantic. They never made it. Augusta had basically fallen to the north by the time they were getting there. And it was a perilous time for them because the North and the South, both parties, soldiers from both sides, wanted the treasure that was still on that not too heavily guarded train. Now, I bring all this up to you because when we were giving this presentation, someone came up to us and said, do you think there could be a connection between that and the Randall Hoard, which was about a lot of cents, copper coin that was found at a Georgia Railroad station. This is very probable. We looked up what was on the train, and they had very detailed records in their manifest of all the gold, the silver, the bars. But they also said they had lots of copper coins. That's all it said. Not 1,000, not 1,000,000, not 20,000, just lots of copper coins. And they're very heavy. And in terms of lugging things around when you're being pursued, as much per pound as the gold and silver. So here's a depiction of the way that the treasure train looked as it left Richmond. People were just piled on every which way they could. And people were very, very concerned about the weight, the safety, and everything else. So go ahead, Becky. Here's the full story. About, I don't know, 7 or 8 kegs, big kegs of copper coin were found when they were restoring an old train station in Georgia. And no one could ever explain where those particular copper coins came from. Randall was simply the name of a coin dealer out of the Northeast. It had nothing to do with the name of the station or anything else. And so people that we talked to at a couple of coin shows said, hey, there's a possibility that they just wanted to get rid of all that copper weight and put it underneath a train station on the line between Washington and stuff. And I think there's a lot of credence to that story. And this is the hoard itself was made of large copper cents. Of course, those were made outmoded or out. They're still legal tender, but they were difficult to circulate by 1857. These were all dated 1818 through 1820. They were all in beautiful, uncirculated or almost uncirculated condition. They were found in these old kegs that you see on the left, very typical of the way things were carried around, in wooden slats, iron straps, and about in that condition, by the way, when they were hauled out of this old train depot. So if anybody has any other further information about the possibility that these coins could have been part of the large haul of copper coin on the treasure train, I'd love to hear from you. Now, we use this as a sort of a segue to talk about the railroads down south and their script and the importance to the economy down in the south, especially the Georgia Railroad and Banking Company that basically was a dominant railroad down there. They did a lot of things to assist the troops at the end of the war. I just want to let you know that they provided free rides to hundreds of soldiers once they were paroled out of Joe Johnston's army. Did so at no cost to the soldiers because they couldn't afford anything. And they did not pay dividends in 1865, so they could afford to do this kind of, they considered patriotic work in 1865. Now, eventually, they got rid of this company, divested itself of the railroad, and became the Georgia, the largest bank in the Southeast. Now, here's just a small sample of all the amazing notes that were circulating in the South, and most of these are transportation notes, obviously. We have a stock certificate of the Georgia Railroad and Banking Company up in the upper left, one of the checks out of Augusta, Georgia on the Georgia Railroad, and the Georgia Railroad, once again, was just a standard $5 note. Banks also were very prevalent. There were state laws that had been passed that allowed railroads and canals to own their own banking company to help expand their operations. It was very common. And this is a really nice old note that we found, the Georgia Railroad and Banking Company from the Civil War. And you can see very clearly it says this is a Confederate Treasury note issued by the Georgia Railroad and Banking Company, 25 cents. The date was February 2nd, 1863. I bring this up to you because this kind of script was worth absolutely nothing when the South fell. However, the Georgia continued to honor these notes to the bearer well after the war, a year or so after the war. They would still honor those notes at face value, even though they were worth absolutely nothing. And that also made them very popular and very well liked in the South. And that building on the right was in Augusta, Georgia. It was built in 1967, 100 years after the Civil War. That's when the Georgia was at its peak power and eventually sold to Wells Fargo Bank. One more example of railroad script. This was issued by the Confederate States of America for the Quartermaster's Department. Quartermasters depended on the railroads to move armaments, supplies, food, clothing, the works. And this was dated in the 1860s. I can't read the date, but anyway, it was to pay a railroad company from Macon to take goods and provisions to Richmond, I believe. And this is the way of sort of a promissory note from the South to pay the railroad or provided the transportation. Okay, now going back to the fate of the treasure train. Here's Washington, Georgia. This is the Savannah River. And here's Augusta, which was a very large munition plant was based. And the train went from Washington to Augusta. This is the way downtown Washington looked at the time, with tons of wagons, a lot of commerce. The wagon train would have shown up and looked just like this. The building that you see there burned down in the late 1800s. It's in the center of town. Becky and I stood at the spot where that photograph was taken. So we kind of got the feeling for where Washington was, how it fit into everything else. They went to Augusta. They had to turn around. They came back, went back up to Abbeville, came back into Washington. A lot of records show they tried to make it to Macon, Georgia. That's a whole different story. Then they came back. So anyway, this area here was heavily traversed by the Georgia Railroad. It was a classic train from the Georgia, and it continued to go over to Atlanta, which was a very important town at that time. Okay, now, while we're in Washington, Georgia, we'll talk about the Toombs silver swap, which involved some money that came off the train. Purportedly, Toombs, who was a very powerful state senator at the time, I believe, he was an outspoken successionist, and he received several $1,000s from the treasure train, which they had hoped he could use to basically get out of the country. He did not want to sign the papers to become a U.S. citizen. He did not want to become a parolee. However, a deal was struck, which we carefully looked at. He brought $5,000 the money off the train to a Union general by the name of Lot Abraham in Washington, and he got something in exchange. Go ahead, Becca. So here's Robert Toombs. Here's his home in Georgia, which we also saw. And later in life, this is the General Lot Abraham, who was basically the garrison commander in Washington, and he was processing all the paperwork for parolees in that area in northern Georgia. So these two men met, and Toombs brought with him thousands of dollars, they say $5,000 in silver coin, which could be made up of other national coins as well. But here's the beautiful reverse of a Carson City silver dollar, which could have very well been in that purse, I guess. Well, no, Carson City didn't start striking coins until 1870. I apologize. So this is a great representation of the money he would have brought to the table. It said in the memoirs of the general that they had a fine cigar and a glass of bourbon, and the money was exchanged. And he was told, the general, not to arrest Robert Toombs, to let him go free in exchange for all that money and a wink and a nod. So go ahead, Beck. And when people got out of town, by the way, they had money belts made for themselves. There are many stories that we read about very influential men from the cabinet, including Toombs, who had these money belts made so they could carry $2,000 or $3,000 worth of coin on their person. Very heavy, 15 to 20 pounds. He said that that would be a big load for men to carry for any length of time. You can see where the individual coins were actually sewn into this belt so no one could purloin them off of the owner. Now we're going to start telling the story about what happened to the Richmond Bank Trove. Separate batch of money, all gold, a lot of bullion, and this money had been sent south. It was intended for robbery. It surrendered. The banks wanted to hold on to the money. They did not want it confiscated, which it was very, very likely to have been done if everyone realized that it had been in the Confederate hands for a while. Anyway, on May 24th, 1865, wagons were set up, lightly guarded, to take 450,000 plus in gold out of Washington and make it back to Richmond. It didn't make it too very far. Here's how it's depicted that on the very first night, 20 miles away from back to the pontoon bridge at the Savannah River. Above the night, the bankers kept notes, said at 11 o'clock, everything was very fine. They were enjoying a nice campfire, just taking care of their private business, getting ready for bed. And suddenly, there was the sound of a lot of clatter of hooves, and a cavalry appeared on the scene. Go ahead. Well, anyway, this cavalry was Confederate, although they were pretending to be Union. And they held up this little wagon and stole about $250,000 in gold coin. And they took everything they possibly could. Later in life, one of them actually reported about how this swag was stolen. And it was peaceful. It didn't hurt anybody. No lives were lost in this big holdup. And people put as much money into wagons, into sacks and bags as they possibly could. And to this day, the road upon which this took place is called Grab-All Road because it is said that the Confederate bushwhackers said, "Grab all you can, boys, the getting is good." So they had that going. And again, what is swag? Swag is money or goods taken by a thief or burglar. And this was definitely an inside job. Go ahead. Now here's a beautiful coin that does figure into this story. From Graball Road in Wilkes County, Georgia, near the Savannah River. One of the households where these guys pulled up, they asked permission to stay on a particular property. And the woman stayed in their home and their property for a night. She saw them stuffing $50 gold pieces, not $20 gold pieces, $50 gold pieces into their boots and into the heels of their boots. And $50 gold pieces, they were from California. That's the only place they were ever struck. This is a great example of one from 1851. But as soon as they opened up the San Francisco Mint, the Ray Lady, wasn't she called? Something like that? Right. These private contractors ceased making the coins, and from the mid-1850s on, they were struck by the U.S. government directly. But it's interesting that from the Richmond Bank Trove, there were dozens and dozens of these beautiful California gold coins. And here's, of course, a picture of some genuine Confederate boots. And it's going to be tough to imagine how they actually put them in their heels, but I guess they could have them hollowed out. I guess they stuffed them in any way they possibly could, and be as safe as they possibly could. And this is from a testimony given by a person who witnessed it firsthand, and Mrs. Moss. She was only in her teens. She was interviewed when she was in her 70s in the 1920s, and she told a story about where all this Southern dough went in this particular case. Now, the other part of the story, which is really interesting, is that as a courtesy, as a reward, these bushwhackers left for the Moss family a box filled with gold coin, silver, jewelry, watches, the works. And it was clearly from a private party. It was not the bank gold. But when we did more research into all the money that moved out of those Richmond banks, a lot of that money was private wealth. And the inventories from the banks just simply showed property of Mrs. Rush or property of Mr. Smith. It did not inventory what was in all these boxes. And private today's safety deposit boxes. But at the time, they were just crates, barrels, and they were stuffed with money. So it wasn't all just the $450,000 in bank, depository bank gold. It was private wealth. And that's why we also speculate that the Knights of the Golden Circle could have been moving money out of Richmond as well. Okay, so this story all gets wrapped up into the life of this particular man, whose name was Mr. Shepherd, Lewis Shepherd. And he was with Vaughn's cavalry, which did protect Jefferson Davis as he made his way south after Johnston surrendered. There were still a couple hundred men that were willing to stick by the retreating Confederate government, I guess you'd have to call it at that point. It didn't dissolve until May 5th. Anyway, these men, not the train, but they overheard discussions of where the train would go. And this man wrote late in life, 1914, in the Confederate Veteran magazine, that he knew where that money went. He was probably one of the guys, might have been that guy right there, looks very similar, who, when he was 20-something, went down and grabbed all he could get. So he told the story about where this money could have ended up to live. So we'll get back to more detail on where it went, but we'll just say Texas, Ohio, California. And he never mentioned any names. And he never said whether or not he had the money either. But he probably did. Now, speaking of Jeff Davis, he kept going separate from the treasure train and separate from another little party that made it into the old sovereign coins. Anyway, President Davis was captured May 10th of 1865 in the tiny village of Irwinville, close to Florida, with him. Now, in terms of coins, rare coins, he had on his person a 50-cent Confederate half-dollar, of which there were only 4 made with a hand-screw press at the New Orleans Mint in April of 1861. They were purely ceremonial. They were more or less tokens of esteem to four men for helping to get the Confederacy going. And of course, Jeff Davis represented the South. The reason why this is so important is it was confiscated off of him when he was captured. He always considered to be what they call a vest pocket piece, to be a talisman of his. He believed it represented his strength, his vision, his courage to lead this new nation. Here's a couple of images of his capture. He was with a small band on horseback, had nothing to do with train at that point. He tried to make it as far as Texas. That's where he was headed, which is where the Trans-Mississippi division of the Confederacy was, which was still going strong. He thought he might get a second chance if he could only get that far, but he did not. He was placed upon an ambulance. He was never harmed in any way, but he was arrested, and he did not regain his citizenship until 110 years after his capture. Now, going back to coins, there's a very little seen representation of a mock coin that was designed by a creative graphic designer in New York, making fun of the South and its representation of trying to make its own money, which they never really did, other than paper money. This is called the Altar of the Confederacy. It was created in 1861, and you can see that the entire premise of the South was rested upon a bale of cotton and a crouching slave. And the obverse says ex uno plurima, which really means out of one, many, rather than out of many, one. And this says centrifugal states of North America. Now, going back on the back, it says, owe ever and pay never. I won't get back into that kind of story later. That was never really a coin. Now, the point here is that we have a shield coin made from one of those Mexican reals. You can clearly see the rays. It says captured from Jeff Davis, May 10th, 1865. This was believed to be a coin that he had in his possession, not on his person, but in his small band of brothers when they were captured. And the North, of course, took all those coins. Somebody was very creative, and they, through their own etching and their own creativity, created these shields, which were called Davis capture shields. And they were apparently believed to have been awarded to the 4th Michigan Cavalry, which is where, of course, the men from both Michigan and Wisconsin captured Jeff Davis. All righty, now we're going to tell a story and get further to the South, and we get into a whole different kind of money, which is, again, sovereigns from Europe. And there was a small band that separated from Davis, and separated from the treasure train in Washington, and it was headed by a fellow who I call his faithful steward. His name was Micaiah Clark. He took a foray that took him all the way down to Gainesville, Florida, before he had to surrender. He was hoping Davis could join him. He was doing everything he could to make the way for his liege, Jeff Davis. It didn't work out. And then the last issue, item that we'll cover, deals with the eulogy for the Confederacy that was found on the back of a Confederate bank note. Okay, a small baggage train, maybe 3 or 4 wagons, were led by this Captain Micaiah Clark. They made good time. It was a small party, well guarded, and their whole objective was to get down to a spot where there was a wealthy plantation owner, a friend of the Davis family, who was willing to put these fellows up, give them some passage through his land. He owned a railroad that went from the west to the east through Florida, so he could move goods and services back and forth. The trouble was, the by the time these guys made it down to this little spot outside of Gainesville, the South had fallen. They had over $25,000 in gold sovereigns, which was intended to be for the lost cause, as it came to be known. But there was a big disagreement amongst the men as to where the money would go. Clark felt it should go to Europe, where it would be held in safekeeping for the South to rise again. And reading Davis's word, which other men in the party said, it'll never happen. Let's do something sensible with the money. So go ahead, Beck. Oh, I'm sorry. Go back if you don't mind for just a minute. I'm sorry. We do have a breakdown of where this money went. Each man got about $8,000. Each of the 8 men got about $2,000 worth of gold, and a big portion was set aside for Verena Davis and her family, since Jeff Davis was heading toward prison. Problem was, the men had to stow the gold in order to surrender and be paroled. Otherwise, the money would be confiscated. So they all had to bury their own little stash, surrender, be paroled, and then come back and their money. Now, the last topic here does deal again directly with the last days of the Confederacy, and it deals with Confederate $10, $50, $500 bills. This so happens to be a version of this last will and testament, if you would, to the South. It was written in Richmond, Georgia, right after Richmond, Virginia, after it fell, and it's written in hand in that old iron ore kind of ink that you can see. It was to honor what happened in the South, and people copied it over and over. And I've seen several versions, but this was actually provided to us by a coin dealer in Maryland who actually has this particular note. I had never held one like it in my hand before. You can see that it clearly came from this beautiful $10 bill that you can see on the left-hand side. So I'm going to read you just one little bit of this and it does deal with the money. You can see this is the second stanza of this lament, and it says, "Too poor to possess the priceless ores, gold and silver, and too much of a stranger to borrow, the South had no credit, so they had to pay for everything in cash. We issue today our promise to pay, our promissory notes, and hope to redeem them on the morrow. The days rolled by, and the weeks became years, but our coffers were empty still. No one was aware that our treasury would quake if a single dollar should drop in the till." So they knew they were poor, they were getting poorer by the day, and the paper money could never be redeemed. So, now, the last note here that I want to share with you has nothing to do directly with the treasure train, but it certainly deals with the South, paper money, and fate. And what we have here is Moneta, who was a Roman goddess that appeared on a 1861 note out of Richmond, Virginia. And Moneta, in the simplest terms, yes, she represents mints and money, but she also had that element of fortune, the wheel of fortune, tied into her powers, if you would. She's surrounded by gold bags, treasure chests, like ones in Washington, Georgia, just loaded to the hilt with money. But the story here is that it was believed that you had to appeal to her and say, "I have a just cause, I'm a good person, I have a good cause, a good fight. Would you please make sure that Providence provides money?" And as you can see, by the end of the Civil War, they didn't have any money. So apparently Moneta did not, shall we say, grant their wishes in 1861. This is all of the stories that we're going to tell today. There are a lot more. We cover things in much more detail in the books. We love to give talks. We'll be at PAN in the end of the month. But anyway, we always love to hear from people with their own stories. We are continuously hearing from coin dealers, authors, people that have a grandparent or great-grandparent that passed down information about the money in the Civil War, especially in that Georgia, South Carolina area. So If you have any more stories to tell us, you share with us. See our emails here. Our phone, which is a cell, is available to you at any time. And both Becky and I thank everybody with the Newman Numismatic Portal for making this possible, and especially our thanks to Leanna. So thank you all, and goodbye.
Thank you.
Before we go into questions, I just wanted to say thank you guys for that awesome presentation. I loved hearing about that. I hadn't really done too much research on the Confederate side of coins before, and so I thought that was really interesting to learn all about that. So thank you guys.
Sure, our pleasure.
If you guys, what?
Oh, we love doing this, so thank you.
Yeah, if you guys want to go ahead and unshare your screen, stop sharing screen, that everyone can see your big version screen.
There you are.
Awesome. And we do have a few questions. So one of them, Rick, do you think that the KGC still protects the money today? And do you think that maybe some of this money could be hiding in Texas?
Wow. I've read many different accounts. I cannot speak with any authority on it. I know there are people who believe that there's a great deal of money out in the far west, now with lands that are owned by the Bureau of Mining and Lands. That's what it is. Texas, I have not heard a specific reference to, but that being said, the KGC was very, very influential in its day. No doubt about that. A lot of money did travel over to Europe through George Trenholm, Secretary of the Treasury, who had offices in Liverpool. They did send at least $85,000 in gold over to Europe when the South would rise again. So again, I don't want to speak, so I know much more about the KGC. I just know that they have been extraordinarily influential in New Orleans when the war broke out. But Texas.
Okay, nice. Let's see if we have another question. Someone said, what happened to the dies for the CSA half dollar?
They actually were in the possession of the guy who was one of the chief mentors at the time, and they were kept safe until 1879 in his possession. Then he sold them to a coin dealer up in New York, who was the one who used those dies to strike these, call them mementos, 2,000, 3,000 coins, but they were struck with the original die. The die wore out very quickly, by the way. It was already used extensively by the South until they stopped using the $10. Just so you know, when the South took over the mint in New Orleans, first it went to the state of Louisiana, about 700,000 additional half dollars. Then it went to the Confederate States of America. They continued to use those same dies and some of the same personnel to continue to make those half dollars that looked exactly like the federal half dollar. In other words, they never converted over to a Confederate die at all. Anyway, bottom line is, I think the guy's name was Scott up in New York. He bought the dies. They were being held together, literally held together with an extra collar, and they struck 2,000 or 3,000 of these strikes. At the time as a memento. And the man who did the restrikes, by the way, was accused of counterfeiting several times. And he eventually had to shave down the coin on one side to restrike it so they were a little lighter. That was still considered facing U.S. money. It went on and on and on. The argument was made in court that even though the Confederate die now belonged to the United States of America, the Confiscation Act, so it was subject to counterfeiting laws. And it was the Confederacy. Anyway, that's a long story. Kept safe and sound and alive for 14 years. And then I think the man's name was Max Manzano, who was very faithful Northern sympathizer. And he was responsible for reopening.
That's very interesting.
He's a very interesting guy. He testified before the Congress. He kept all the records straight. He had to rebuild the interior of the mint because all the printing presses and everything valuable was stripped by the Confederacy for scrap metal.
Wow. I have another question, and I know that you know a little bit about this one. Could you talk about books or articles about this? I know you've written a few books on this, so
yeah,
talk to us a little bit about the books that you've written on this stuff.
Oh, the books themselves or other books that I have read? The two that we've written?
Sure, yeah.
Oh, okay. The first one is called The Flight of the Very Curious Flight of the Confederate Treasure Train, or Where Did All the Southern Dough Go? That particular book spent a hefty amount of energy, about 50 or 60 pages, devoted to the actual travel of the train, which towns it went through, what happened in those towns, why certain things happened. The thing that caught my eye, but apropos almost nothing, but it's amazing. Some of the little towns that train went through are almost the same in size as they were in 1865. I'll be specific. Madison, Florida, at 2,000 or so people in the county now, it has 2,000 people today. However, Charlotte, North Carolina, where the mint was, it had 5,000 people living. 800,000 people today. And today it's twice as big as Atlanta, Georgia, which during the Civil War was the biggest town. Now I bring that up to you because, hey, I would, instead of the money going to Texas, I would, some of it was left right there in Charlotte, and that's where they got the jump start to become such a huge metropolis, because they dwarf all the other towns in the South, including Atlanta, which is the other book, Sumptuous Stories. We wanted to make sure that you guys knew we really admire the telling of stories to help numismatic beginners take a real interest in currency by telling stories about it, making sure people knew how important the money was and how transformational some of these events were. I mean, we wouldn't have paper money if it wasn't for this. We wouldn't have an internal revenue. Secret Service was born at counterfeiting. It had nothing to do with protecting the president, which is ironic for Abraham Lincoln, you have to admit. So my point of telling you that is the Sumptuous Stories book really focuses on local stories, things that have a numismatic interest, like the Randall Board. We get into the big Confederate treasure chest that was discovered in Washington and still there to this day. There are many, many very interesting stories that Sumptuous Stories gets into, more so than the chronological or the players' stories that are in the first book. And we are still collecting stories. So we love to continue telling these tales. And we're lucky enough to hook up with a guy named Tom Poland down in South Carolina, who is a real history buff and a big writer. He himself grew up where the treasure train had come to town. His granddaddy told him stories about the treasure train that were passed down to him. So my point is, these sorts of things really start to take on a life of their own, start to learn about other people, their family history. Fascinating. So that's what the second book is all about. We did write one called Minting, Printing, and Counterfeiting, the trifecta of making money during the Civil War. So again, for the collector who wants to learn how coins were made, money was minted, printed, and how important, prevalent counterfeiting was. That's another interesting thing. We're working on a fourth book now.
Very cool.
Yeah.
So if anyone wants to learn more about this, definitely check out those books. Those would be great resources to learn just a ton about the Confederate money and all of that great history that comes along with it. It is 11 now, and I want to respect everybody's time. We have another presentation with the NNP starting at 11:30, so I will give you guys a little bit of a break before you guys, if you guys want to hop onto that one. So give you a little bit of a break, but thank you again, Rick, for that wonderful presentation, and thank you to everybody for sticking with us with all of the technical difficulties. We're working to figure that out as best as we can. So sorry about that, and thank you for sticking with us.
Bye.
Have a great rest of your day, everybody. Thank you for coming.